Hello, good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming to Surat's seminar. It's great. We were not supposed to have a seminar now, but Surat has his CCSP proposal, so he has to use seminar in this room. And I'm not going to talk about your topic, but Surat has been educated in the US with a bachelor and a master degrees in economics, and he has a very impressive experience, many years of experience in quite top positions. So I'm pretty sure we're going to learn a lot from you today and through the 2.5 years that you're going to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm excited to be here today. So I'll be presenting on my research proposal today and briefly going through what I'll be doing over these 3.5 years. And the topic of my research is assessing the linkages and trade-offs between biodiversity conservation and human welfare from a protected area context in Nepal. And my supervisors are Dr. Ram Pandit and Dr. Chunbo Ma. So before I start, I would like to acknowledge that we're in a Noongar land and we respect that, and just want to acknowledge this going forward. So if we look at the outline, I'll just briefly go through what motivated me for this research, and again, moving on to the research objectives afterwards. Why is this research so significant to be done? And at the end, we'll just go through the chronological order of these proposed research studies. So brief motivation, I think I've been working in this environmental research field for a while now, and looking at science and society linkages, and again, environmental impacts on human well-being in some way or other in small projects here and there. So that sort of driven me to do this holistical project and put it up as a PhD research project. And it all comes down to, again, what are the connections between environment and human well-being? And I've always been intrigued in that subject for a while now. And it's also an important topic because it does give us an impetus to develop effective ways to, have that balance in the world. Basically, the overall research objective that I have is, again, to assess the linkages and trade-offs between conservation and human welfare in the context of protected area in Nepal from a benefit and cost perspective. And this would, so the exploration would start off from actually linking these two together in terms of theoretical concept. The first one would look into conservation versus human welfare in a protected area context, and how that has been carried out over the years in past studies, and to look into whether an alternative sector like ecotourism can actually play a channeling role to benefit in terms of balancing this out and benefit the well-being of in the end. And so this sort of transitions into the ecotourism side of things, where we look into what is the value of the economic value of ecotourism recreation services in this context, and without losing sight of the trade-offs that happen, of course, because the only benefits aren't to be looked at. And looking at it from a cost perspective, we also look into this trade-off that is very significant at this point, which is a human-wildlife conflict. And we look into what its impact are on income and well-being in a holistic manner, to be able to devise ways of coexistence that can be looked into. And at the end of it, holistically, we look into how can this trade-off be balanced by biodiversity finance mechanisms, both public and private, and looking into what is the status of this mechanism at the moment, and how can we bridge the gap going forward. So that's in a snapshot what the trajectory looks like in this research journey. Why is this significant? Because exploration of the channels in terms of alternative sector as an ecotourism services has not been looked at in a brief quantitative way. And there are dearth of studies where quantitative they have explored such linkages. Again, ecotourism is a emerging topic at hand, and in order to justify it as a means of biodiversity conservation finance, it needs to be clear what are the benefits accrued from it. So this will justify it as a mechanism for finance. And thirdly, again, we'll be looking at human-wildlife conflict from a well-being perspective, where a multidimensional well-being index approach will be taken, where this hasn't been done as much in research. So that would also add to the research space in general. So when we move on to the specific studies, as I mentioned earlier, we establish the conservation versus human welfare linkages. And when we're looking at that linkage, theoretically, there have been quite mixed results over the years. And briefly, there are two schools of thoughts where the first school of thought that uses the basic assumption of von Thunen model, it reports in a negative effect in terms of the effect of conservation on human welfare. And these studies have mostly concluded that conservation has a negative effect on economic welfare or human well-being in general because of its limiting land use scenario. And this school of thought has emphasized its negative effect. At the same time, when we look at another school of thought where a lot of recent studies have looked into that if an alternative sector develops over the years, it can actually have a positive effect on welfare. So in a sense, we do take that idea on board and try to see if this is true in our case as well. And specifically the ecotourism development side of things, where if that alternative sector develops, then does that have a beneficial impact as thought of? And so this first study looks into that linkage theoretically, and it's trying to test out empirically as well to see if those linkages are there. And a typical linkage is the U-shaped curve where welfare and conservation have that relationship. And we initially test and establish that as well. And also test and see if ecotourism has that positive effect on human welfare by devising this empirical model. This comes as a secondary data derived from Nepal Living Standard Survey, which is a latest one, 2022-23. And we tend to use this data to investigate this relationship and try to see if ecotourism can be that alternative sector which would push that curve upward, benefit from it. And typical relationship here as well. So at the same time, I think this would also lead on to the ecotourism side of things as a pretext to the next study, where we would be looking into more of what value does ecotourism services offer for this to be able to be beneficial. And as I already mentioned earlier, it has emerged as a viable financing mechanism to be able to balance a conservation as well as human well-being. And it is a proponent to be able to support this. And so this is one of the reasons why we're looking into valuation of this recreation services. And typically, we're looking to use a travel cost method, a version of it at least. And this is a revealed preference method, as we are all aware. And it's typically estimating a demand curve, but in this instance, it is slightly varying because instead of taking number of visits as our dependent variable, we're looking to take number of days as a dependent variable because of uh, reasons that, the visits tend to be longer and it tends to be multiple visits as well. So we are trying to see if this can be a viable exploration methodology. And just a few studies have been done regarding taking this as a number of days as this dependent variable for this analysis. And a key point here is to look into the travel costs in detail. Looking at on-site expenses, round-trip costs, and opportunity costs as well. And again, to be able to solve this empirical model, we do look into zero truncated Poisson model and the negative binomial model because of the negative integer nature of the data. And so this is what we are proposing to use as evaluation of ecotourism recreation services. And this would be the benefit side of things. And when we move on to the cost or the trade-off side of things, where we look into human-wildlife conflict and its impact on income and well-being. And it's been there have been a lot of quantitative studies done over the past that have looked into its effect in terms of quantifying the costs. However, the research so far has not looked into in a holistic way where they have included a multidimensional well-being index, sort of applied that in the context. And so I think that gap needs to be filled in terms of how that holistic impact is there of the human wildlife conflict. And we look to do this by building this well-being index where a lot of dimensions are included. It would also include basic life satisfaction, health, physical and mental, social relations, again, social safety nets come into play. And all of that sort of constitutes to this well-being index as a latent variable. And now, just looking at a simple linear model that looks into human wildlife conflict and well-being and income, it sort of is quite simple empirically, but it doesn't really cut the complex relationship that these three have. So we're also looking into, besides suggesting this simple empirical model in the beginning, we would also be looking into maybe a more depth of structural equation modeling where we would be looking at a complex relationship between a human-wildlife conflict, income, and well-being, and how those reciprocal relationships can be explored as well. There's still slightly in exploration stage at the moment, but this is what we're looking to achieve from this. So from moving on from the trade-offs and the benefit side of things, we take a holistic turn at the end in terms of how this trade-off can be managed. Obviously, there is a finance gap that we all know of. And so in order to be informed of the current status of finance and biodiversity conservation, we look into this assessment of the status of the current funding scenario, both public and private, and look into whether this can be the biodiversity finance gap can be filled out by either repurposing negative subsidies or maybe even managing to get more private funding. So in terms of the importance of this at the moment, because the funding crunch is happening quite extensively, and donor funding has decreased quite a bit. So this comes at an opportune moment where we could repurpose negative subsidies or negative effects of funding from the public expenditure side and try and recommend to have that repurposed. So this assessment would essentially give that impetus and give evidence in terms of what financing mechanisms can better close that gap. So in a nutshell, I think that's about it. I hope I'm okay.
Yeah, thank you very much for that presentation. It was great and great timing.
20 minutes.
16. You better.
Could you leave that one up?
Yes, sir.
In full screen?
Sure.
Yeah, first we will open the floor for questions, but because this is a proposal, does anyone has any suggestion that could help Sugat with his research going forward?
So the component on well-being looks very interesting. We had a PhD student complete his PhD just 3 years ago, and a very large focus of his work was on well-being, and he developed a novel system, a multi-dimensional system for quantifying well-being, which would be useful for you to learn about. So his name was Ken Wallace. I've got a copy of the PhD that I'll share with you. And I wasn't clear how you were going to get the data for that, but the way he did it was through self-reported, through the subjects were in a workshop in his case, so you can imagine it happening in the survey, where they were self-reporting their expectations about each of the components of well-being, sort of scoring them, would this be better or worse? Would this scenario, if it played out, be better or worse, and how much better or worse than the status quo? And then combined, I think it was 10 perhaps different components that got combined together. But it did seem to be a good approach that worked quite well.
That sounds like a good illustration to look into.
Yeah.
My initial thinking was very similar. We devised a questionnaire where this Likert scale can come into play.
Yeah.
And as you correctly mentioned, that's a series of questions where it is devised in a way that you can get that from there.
But it's very good to pick up work that someone else has done, if it's been done well, rather than have to reinvent it.
Of course. Yeah. Thank you.
Michael?
Completely unclear to me as to where any of your data is coming from. It's something about that. Could you explain a bit about what your data collection process is going to be to underpin not just this, but the whole thing?
Sure. So the first question, the linkages, the data is coming from Nepal Living Standard Survey. It's a secondary data. But for the second and third question for ecotourism, where we use travel cost method, the data is coming as a primary survey. At the same time, the human wildlife conflict will also have a survey. So those two are coming from primary surveys, and the first one is coming from the secondary data from Nepal Living Standard Survey, the latest one.
Okay, so but the tourism one isn't about households, it's about
the visitors.
visitors. So you're doing a visitor survey on a park? Have you identified?
Yes, so sorry, I missed the the location, maybe because of the haste, I guess. So this protected area, we're at least envisioning this would be a national park. So at the moment, what comes to mind is Chitwan National Park in Nepal. So there, whoever visits the national park area, we're going to survey them. So
on that one, site-wise, I think he's still discussing with the resource he has, but ideally, ecologically, there are 3 zones. We're taking representative power from 3 zones to see what's the replacement value of the tourism in that context. So I think that would definitely.
Can I keep going?
Yes,
Just niggling away at data.
sure.
The big national survey.
Okay.
So what you're going to do is pick up households that presumably are close to national parks and those that are further away and use
Right,
presumably physical location as being
right.
a measure of what then the consequence is.
Mhm.
How do you control for all the other variables that might be correlated with the location, but which aren't really about national parks? I mean, so just in terms of identification, you're trying to identify the effect of, presumably, at a point in time, not over time, being close to what does close mean?
Right.
To a national park.
Uh-huh.
So have you got that methodology worked out as
So
identification?
I need to explore more on that. I'll be honest, but it would the protected area, like I guess, share of that area, maybe it can be derived from ARC-GIS or maybe GIS system where that can be mandated as a protected area. So my initial thinking is along those lines. So maybe that would help out in, as you said, having that area as a specific protected area system. So that is my initial thinking, and I'm trying to.
This maybe my room, who's in the room knows this. Tapasa did exactly the same process, didn't he, in Ethiopia?
Yeah.
So you should dig up
Okay.
his thesis.
Tapasa.
Because there's lots of parallels, I think, between what Tapasa was doing and you're doing. And you did matching, like trying to match households and then control, and use that to
Okay.
control for.
Right.
Propensity score matching.
Right. Propensity
Yeah,
score.
so dig
Okay.
up his papers and
Sure.
figures, I think.
What was this? Tapasa?
Yeah, I can send it
Sure.
to the.
I mean,
Yeah, very interesting. What wasn't clear to me is the context.
Uh-huh.
This, I think it's because conservation has been on the limelight right now. And there are a lot of debates that are going about conservation and the agenda even behind conservation. I think if you Google, you'll find it's a book that has been written, The Greatest Conservation Lie.
Okay.
I'm not sure if anyone read that.
Yes.
And so coming back to maybe what you're doing, first of all, what the one that you're looking at, human wildlife conflict, could you be specific about the context? Because I wasn't sure. When you talk about conservation and human wildlife is just very general. So
Right.
are you talking about elephants, for instance, trampling on the farm of farmers in Nepal?
Uh-huh.
What is the context? That wasn't clear to me.
Right.
Yeah. And then when you define conservation, from whose perspective? I think the question that is becoming is from whose perspective are you defining conservation?
Okay.
And I'll give examples, for instance, like I come from Kenya, and we have had these conservation projects, and farmers are being grouped and they are being taken away from the national parks,
Right.
and they have lived there from millennium there. That's where they have lived with the wildlife.
Mhm.
But now they are being taken away from there in the name of conservation.
Right.
And so the question actually that is being to the conservation for who? In whose object? Because those farmers have coexisted with wildlife very peacefully.
Right.
But now, because of maybe the political reasons that are going on, then somebody's coming to tell them that no, now we are starting to have a conflict between humans and wildlife. And now we need to conserve this place. So I think it begs then that question, when you define conservation, from whose perspective, from whose lens are you looking at? Is it from the farmer's perspective? Because for the farmers, if you interview them, they say that they don't see any conflict between what they are doing and wildlife. But from the people, whether it is the funders or whoever they are pushing the agenda, they want to conserve or create parks, then they'll say that no, there is this conflict. Maybe it's the government that wants to collect money from tourism. So having that lens, I think what I'm saying is that you need to question things and be critical and don't take things as face value based on what you're just being told that this is conservation, this is what you need to look beyond that when you're trying to frame the question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can I say to that? That resonates with the thinking that I was grappling with. The way the work comes across at the moment is several pieces, several discrete pieces.
Right.
And a lot of PhDs do that, and it can work very well.
Right.
But it feels like it would be beneficial in your case to have something like an overarching conceptual framework within which these pieces sit.
Okay.
And, because as Amin is saying, conservation is a complicated issue, and there are pros and cons, benefits and costs.
Right.
And the benefits and costs are different for different stakeholders. It'd be sort of nice if somehow you could sort of map that out, at least conceptually,
Right.
and say, at the very least, then you could say, this is where within this sort of complicated web of factors, this is where your studies sit.
Okay.
But it might even help you to think about what you want to say about the overall question,
Right.
to have it more holistically mapped out rather than in individual pieces.
Right. I think I take that suggestion very positively, because I've been thinking about that quite a bit. It does. We're still working on having that, the cohesive, collective factor to it, because it does look like a bit of pieces here and there. But
It struck me when you were talking, you were saying some studies have found that conservation has a negative impact and some have found a positive. But that's a bit superficial, right? If you dig in, well, the ones where it's negative, it's probably cases where elephants are tramping on farms' crops.
Right.
The ones where it's positive, it's probably because there's ecotourism, right? So there's actually completely different things going on.
True.
It's more than just, but you sort of have bundled them together under the sort of term conservation, but really it's not just about conservation as such, it's how it's done, the way, the context in which it occurs.
Right. Right. Yeah, I think some brainstorming needs to go in that direction. Thank you.
Yeah, and also Curtis gave you some feedback in the chat. I will email it to you.
Okay.
And he's overseas, but he has been very kind to join us. So you can ask him more about that later.
Sure.
All right, it's time to go. But if you want to keep talking with Sugat here, you're welcome to do so. Thank you. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.